first, a story, but I want you to think of your favorite animal, bird, reptile, ocean species, insect, or tree. Mine is the sea otter, floating on its back. I saw it in the fjords of Alaska while I was kayaking. Now, imagine that species is gone. Poof, no longer there for you or anyone else to see. The Center for Biological Diversity was started by 3 young men, one who was studying philosophy, another conservation biology, and the last working in education programs for at-risk youth. They found a rare Mexican spotted owl nesting in an old-growth tree, because that's where it has to nest, and found that that tree, along with the forest it was in, was slated to be cut down. They took their findings to the Forest Service manager, but the agency was more interested in completing the logging plan. So the 3 young men took the story to the local paper, and the tree was never cut. Well, the Center for Biological Diversity was created by those 3 young men and continues today, working through legal means, science, and creative media to protect species and, of course, the places they need to live. So today, I would like you to walk away from here knowing 3 different ways the human population impacts wild species. Name 3 top ways that you can reduce human impact, and understand the best practices to reduce global population growth. And of course, I'm here to answer your questions. So I'd like to frame it in terms of, what do people and animals need for health and survival? Right? Well, we all need food. Good food is best, whether we're animals or people. We all need a place to live that will protect us. This picture was taken after the Superstorm Sandy, and the picture on the lower right is a beaver dam. We also need clean air. The picture up on the left is a bad air day with smog or high ozone that makes people sick. And of course, fires cause particulate matter and dioxins in the atmosphere that harms us even if we're not part of the fire or in the fire. Ew, isn't this picture awful? We need clean water, and so do all species. But there are other things that humans need that animals don't, at least since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Actually, for many centuries, people have used cooking fuel, typically wood or created charcoal. But now we need a lot of electricity, a lot of energy. We need transportation. We're not walking everywhere we need to go. We need jobs so that we can buy food, because most of us don't grow it anymore. Well, that impacts our planet. So how many of us are there? And I don't have a poll for this, but pick a number there. What do you think the number of the population is? Well, it's actually 7.6 billion people on the planet. And I'm going to show this graph. This graph is a picture of exponential growth. So it took 9,000 years to go from 100 million people to 1 billion in 1804, about the time of the start of the Industrial Revolution. Then it took another 123 years to double again to 2 billion in 1927. And then, faster, it took just 47 years to double by 1974, just around the time of the first Earth Day. Oops, sorry, clicked too fast. And then doubling time has slowed, but really stayed the same. So we've gone up in another 50 years. It's projected by 2024 that we'll be at 8 billion. So right now we're at 7.6 billion people. Well, that has a huge impact. Oops. Now the next slide. So I like to put this in terms of billions don't mean very much to me. So if you can imagine that the growth on the planet, every single day, a city the size of Thousand Oaks, California is added to the planet. In 2 weeks, some of you are from Chicago, a city the size of Chicago is added every 2 weeks. A new Germany is added every year, and another China every 16 years. So that is pretty phenomenal growth. So let's look at this a different way, and you can do this at home if your parent allows you to have a bag of rice. Take a chessboard. And this is a story, it's a famous legend about the origin of chess. And when the inventor of the game showed the chess game to the Emperor of India, he was so impressed by the new game that he said to the man, "Name your reward." The man responded, "Oh, Emperor, my wishes are simple. I only wish for this. Give me 1 grain of rice for the first square on the chessboard, 2 for the next, 4 for the following, and 8 for the next, and so on, for all 64 squares, with each square having double the number of grains as the square before." The emperor agreed, amazed that the man asked for such a small reward, or so he thought. After a week, his treasurer came back and informed him that the reward would add up to an astronomical sum, far greater than all the rice that could be conceivably grown in centuries. So what we've seen on the planet is exponential growth of the human population. Here's another way to look at doubling time. This glass of water, let's say it is filled with bacteria that doubles in population every minute. So if you could pull up the first poll. Some of you I know are in classrooms, but others can actually answer on your computer. So how long will it take to fill up this glass? Can you get the question up? There we go. So you can answer this on the computer. Is it going to take an hour, 30 minutes, 5 minutes, or a minute? Somebody's answered 30 minutes, 1 hour. So again, bacteria reproduce at the rate of reproduction every minute. How many minutes will it take to double the population in that glass? Okay, I'm going to stop the poll. And the answer is 1 minute. So if populations are doubling, they do it slowly at first. It's kind of like cancer. You don't detect cancer until it's big. And so by the time you have a cancer that's undetectable, but it's going to double in size at 0.5 centimeter, the next doubling size is 1 centimeter. So this glass will be filled in 1 minute. So unfortunately, we're seeing an exponential increase in the number of wild animals, plants, trees, and so on that are going extinct. There's currently about 8.7 million species on the planet, give or take a million. But by 2050, a number of scientists are very concerned that 30 to 50% of all species will go extinct. So how do we share our world? Well, let's look how we're sharing it right now. If we were to measure how much everybody weighed, it would be about 125 million tons of humans on the planet. So, do you think that all the cows on the planet weigh more than us or less? You can answer that for yourselves. And the answer is more. 170 million tons of cattle live on the planet to feed us and provide us milk. How about the rest of the livestock that we grow? Cows, chickens, sheep. Well, it's another 130 million tons of meat, of animals that are grown for meat. And so what does that leave for all the rest of the wild animals, the reptiles, anybody with a vertebrate on land? Is only 10 million tons of wild land animals left on the planet compared to us and our livestock. Well, we don't see this on a day-to-day basis unless you study the biology. So it's very hard for people to understand that. Sadly, but because people need to eat, 50% of our habitat has been turned into farmland, whether that's livestock or growing feed for livestock or growing food directly for us. Overall, we've seen a reduction in species numbers by about 50%. And just some examples, a 90% reduction in all top of the fish predators, things like tuna, cod, halibut, marlins. 270,000 sharks are killed every day for shark fin soup. And sadly, 50% of all warm water coral reefs have died already. Now, coral reefs are kind of like the tropical forest of the ocean, and a quarter of all species need coral reefs to thrive. So we're not sharing the planet very well at all. So let's look at one example, the endangered Florida panther. Beautiful, beautiful creature. Its range is markedly reduced. It used to be all over the southern eastern part of the United States, all the way to Louisiana. And pumas were widespread from the east to the west coast. Today, the Florida panther is the only large feline remaining in the southeast, and it's separated from western populations by 1,000 miles. It now only lives or is able to breed in about 5% of its former range down in southern Florida. When it was first put on the endangered species list, so the Endangered Species Act is an act that was passed to try and protect animals and trees and plants and fish if they were felt to be potentially going downhill. And only 10 or 20 of the panthers were left at that time in 1967. It's endangered because it doesn't have a lot of place to live. It needs to hunt in its prey. That little blue area that I'm circling, I don't know if you can see my cursor, is the Florida Panther National Wildlife Refuge. It's an area 26,000 acres, which is 40 square miles. But to put this in comparison, a male puma, or male panther, needs about 40 miles to go to find its own territory. So Donna has just asked a question: would it be fair to say that big agricultural industry uses more resources than basic farming or self-sustaining farming? Well, we don't really have enough land to put everybody back on the land and make us all grow our own food. But I would say for sure that the meat industry, where the vast majority of corn, soy, and even wheat goes to feeding the cattle, sheep, goats, and chickens that we eat, takes up a lot of room. So looking at other ways of farming and choosing not to eat meat is one way that we can manage that. So the panther, the most common cause of death is being killed by a car. The current number of panthers are about 100 to 160, but they really need to have genetic variation and growth, but they can't keep up with the rate of death. There's a lot of farms around that area. They can't get north of a particular river that's in the southern area. Oops, I'm sorry. So the bottom picture is a picture of one of the types of habitat. It's actually an animal that can live in many types of habitat. This particular habitat is called the slash pine habitat. And the pine trees are actually threatened also. So they are very hardwood for a pine. So they were cut for construction. And they were also slashed or cut because they produce turpentine, kind of like maple syrup, but turpentine instead is made from these trees. And the picture on the top is a field of strawberries without a tree in sight. So one way that we can improve our agriculture, to answer the question from before, is to add more trees to agricultural land that can house birds, pollinators, bees, bats, and take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So there's ways that we can do agriculture in a much more sustainable way. I think some of the panthers are actually tracked with collars, but I think they try and do observational. So I'm not involved in the tracking of the panthers, which was a question that somebody just asked. So not only do we need to eat, and we need clean air and water, just like all species do, we tend to want more and more. We also call that overconsumption. So some of these exponential graphs have to do with true needs. We need water. We need a certain amount of it. As you may have read in the newspaper, Cape Town, South Africa, is running out of water. They're going to have bottled water for the entire city because there isn't any water from where they usually get it. We're using incredible amounts of fertilizer. We are driving a lot of cars. So families, when cars were first invented, just 118 years ago or so, most people didn't have a car. And then families got one car, and now families have multiple cars. We consume an incredible amount of paper and construction material. And McDonald's. Exponential growth of McDonald's. How about that? So a couple other questions. What's the best way to dispose of carbon dioxide? Well, currently, the way the Earth does it is it actually gets absorbed into the ocean. And it makes the ocean more acid. And that's one of the problems with coral reefs, because they don't like the higher acidity in the ocean. Carbon dioxide is taken up by all plants. That's their basis for making sugars to feed themselves. And so one way to get rid of more carbon dioxide is to plant more trees, is to build back the forests that we've cut down or that we're continuing to cut down. Another question was on the fertilizer consumption, and I can't say why that plateaued or dropped. I'm not sure. Okay. So another sign of overconsumption is the average house and household size in the United States. So we've actually, the yellow part of the graph is the number of people who live in one house. So when I grew up, my grandmother lived with us. But now the numbers are dropping. So the average household only has a little over 2 people in it. So a lot of people obviously live alone, and others live in larger families. But despite the numbers of people living in a single house, the size of the house has tripled over time. So that's an example of overconsumption. So another problem with our meat production, just to give another example of overproduction, and let me say also that in the 1960s, we ate half the amount of meat per day than U.S. people are eating today. So the demand for meat has doubled. And sadly, it produces an awful lot of manure and an awful lot of methane, because cows, sheep, and goats actually belch an awful lot of gas, which is methane, which is another greenhouse gas. And in terms of livestock, out particularly in the West, there's a lot of federal land that's protected under the Bureau of Land Management and our national forests. And people can apply to get a grazing permit to allow their cattle to actually eat grass on national land. But sadly, there's over 175 endangered species living on the same land that are threatened by the livestock. So who's going to win, the livestock or the wildlife? So here's the next poll that I will allow you to take a little bit more time on. What are the top 4 ways to reduce your own carbon footprint? This is one way of looking at our consumption, is how much carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalent that we each produce. So we produce carbon dioxide by using electricity, by driving cars, by eating food that's transported to you, by consuming a whole lot of other things. So the numbers look like they're kind of going back and forth. Okay, again, I'm not sure if the classes can actually vote, but I think it's evenly split pretty much between these it's recycling, having 1 fewer child, eating a plant-based diet, and going car-free. So you can close, actually I can close that and show you a graph. So number 1, having 1 fewer child. Lowers your carbon footprint because that child grows up into an adult. That child grows up into an adult who potentially has children, and that all makes your carbon footprint much greater than any other activity that you can do to reduce your carbon footprint. The next one is actually living car-free. In the city of Washington, D.C., I was able to not own a car, although I rented them occasionally and used mass transit and biked. But many areas don't have adequate mass transit for us to do that. Avoiding a round-trip transatlantic flight is actually the 3rd. And then going on a plant-based diet. So that includes no milk, and using plants for our protein. So I just want to mention that Arnold Schwarzenegger eats a plant-only diet. Cows eat a plant-only diet, and they have a lot of muscle also that we eat as beef. So people can be very strong and frankly healthier eating a plant-based diet. So you may want to try going plant only 1 day a week to check it out. Try out some new recipes to do that, and see what is the toughest thing to give up. But having 1 fewer child is something to think about in the future. So how many children do people have on the planet? Well, back in 1950, women were having on average 5 children globally. obviously lower in some countries and higher in other countries. As you can see from this graph that was created by the United Nations Sustainable Development Program, it dropped to 3 in the 1990s, 2.5 currently is approximately the level. They estimate the fertility rate will go down to 2.2 by the mid-century and down to 2 by the end of the century. So replacement population is 2.1. So that takes into account children who are going to die. Sort of child mortality is implied in a the 2.1 replacement level. So we saw what the charts were. So by mid-century, with a growth fertility rate, even though it's declining at 2.2, we will have 9.7 billion people on the planet. So another 2 billion people will live on the world. By the end of the century, the number will be 11 billion. So it will double or increase by only another billion. So somebody wrote in the text box, population control. It is a chilling subject, but I want to tell you a story that I think will illustrate a better way of going. So there was a Middle Eastern country back in 1988 that said, 1 child is good, 2 is enough, as a motto for their country. So you guys can take 5 seconds and decide, was it Yemen, was it Israel, was it Iraq, was it Syria, or was it Iran? It was actually Iran, interestingly enough. And they did it without population control. In the Quran, well, let me start at the beginning. During the Iran-Iraq War in 1980 to 1988, the motto for the country was, have more children because we need to have a 1 million-man army, actually a 20 million-man army. But the leadership of the country, including Ayatollah Khomeini, realized that the economy couldn't sustain a growing population at the rate of 7 children per woman. That was their fertility rate at the time. And there's actually a passage in the Quran that says that people should not have more children than they can take care of, than they can provide for. So they and other religious leaders issued policy to make birth control available and acceptable. So they said it's okay not to have so many children. And over the next 10 years, the fertility drop went from 7 to 2. It wasn't a China policy at all, which I can chat about briefly, but they provided birth control for free. I can chat about briefly, but they provided birth control for free, whatever kind you want, whether it was a birth control pill, a vasectomy, which is a way of making men infertile. This little device here is called an IUD, an intrauterine device that is placed inside the uterus. That along with this little tiny piece that you wouldn't have even noticed if I didn't point it out, is an implant, and that releases hormones over 3 to 5 years, 3 years for the most commonly used one. That works just like the pill does, but you don't have to think about it every day. So these 2 methods of birth control are greater than 99% effective. They cost more upfront, but over the 3 to 5 to 10 years of use, they are less costly than condoms. So Iran made all these methods available. They educated the healthcare providers so that they could learn how to dispense them. They developed a model network of healthcare providers in rural, underserved areas that also provided health care for many other issues, like free diabetes care and other high-risk problems. And then they said, we need education, because education is the other major aspect of this. And couples were required to take a family planning counseling program before marriage. University students had to take a class in family planning also. And in addition, they worked very hard to get women and girls educated. When women and girls are more educated, they're more empowered. They take control of their lives. They advocate for themselves. They want a career for themselves, and they want fewer children. So in Iran, women outnumber the men in universities because they use a test to say who can get in and who can't by 65 to 35. They actually had to start quotas to make sure enough men went to the university. And nearly all young girls go to school, even in the rural areas, unlike many other countries, especially nomadic populations are really hard to make go to school. So there was a question in the chat box that says there is a situation in China where it was decreed that there would be significant disincentives. In other words, the children, if you had more than one child, there were penalties, financial penalties to pay, that you couldn't get your child into school. And they said you had to stop at one child. Well, they made exceptions for minority groups that lived in the mountains. They could have up to 3 children because they were primarily farming families. And they loosened up the one-child policy most recently to allow more than one, particularly if people came from a single family themselves. So they have reduced their fertility rate. It's not the lowest in the world. And that is a coercive method, just as an alternative example to the way that Iran managed to reduce their fertility rate. Sadly, the United States practiced certain methods and sterilized people who were hospital or in institutions because they had low IQ, for example. So our organization, and frankly any reproductive rights organization worldwide, would never advocate for population control, coercive methodologies. Genocide, of course, was done during World War II. And continues to go on with certain ethnic populations like the Rohingya in Myanmar. Eugenics was the science that some types of people are better than others, or there's certain traits better than others that I was talking about with, forced sterilization of people with low IQ in this country. And immigration probably is an issue that it's a global population problem. Immigration isn't a way to manage population. So again, just to reiterate, advocating for women's rights, women's right to education, women's rights for control of their own body when and if they want to have a child, that they have the opportunity to be able to choose that. It's a social justice issue and frankly a quality of life issue. So think about which countries have the highest and the lowest fertility rates. Didn't make a poll for this one. So Singapore is currently the lowest at 1.2. Singapore is a island nation, so it's lower, as are a number of countries lower than China, including many European countries. Niger is the one with the highest fertility rate. It is the country that is just south of Libya, south of the Sahara Desert, that used to have very verdant, fertile land, which is unfortunately being turned into desert by climate change. So, as you can imagine, how many women in Niger have advanced education? Well, it's less than 1%. And the rates for women in Singapore are obviously vastly higher, where all women go to school. They may not all go to the university, but they all go to school. So that's one aspect. Another is culture. So it's a sign of wealth to have more children. And there's a lot of conversations going on in Niger to try and have that conversation with people. Men there have up to 4 wives, and again, it's a sign of prestige to father many children. So one question that came on the chat box is, are educated women naturally wishing to have fewer children? Well, you can ask your parents and your parents' friends why they chose to have as many children as they did. So I went to medical school. I did not want to have a child while I was in college or in medical school. And so many women who are educated delay their first pregnancy. So the United States actually has for developed countries, has the youngest age of first pregnancy, which on average is age 26. In Europe, it's over 30. And that is for many reasons. I'm not sure if I kept that slide in. I don't think I did. So why do you think other reasons that people don't want to have as many children? Well, it's expensive. College is expensive. Actually, I think I did leave this line in. In this country, there isn't paid childcare. So it's expensive to have your child in childcare if you want to go to work. So as women value careers, they are more likely to have fewer children. So what can we do about this population issue? All right. So I'm back. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened. So I was speaking about the global gag rule. Did you folks hear that? I'm going to actually go on from there, actually. So here in the United States, our fertility rate is 1.84. So at that rate, just looking at the rate alone, we are below replacement. But because we had so many children through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, there's still more people having children than previous. So our population is actually going up yearly. That's called population momentum, if you want to know the term for it. But we have other issues here in this country. One is a very high unplanned pregnancy rate. So up to 45% of pregnancies were not planned. And one of the ways that we can improve that rate is to make sure that birth control and all types of birth control are available, and that health providers know how to counsel women about the various types of birth control. Another method that is very helpful is to make sure that all young people are provided with information about sex education, which contraceptives are available, what works and what doesn't, that birth control does not affect fertility. Obviously, taking into consideration what women want, what they Some women don't want to use birth control. That's perfectly fine. But for those who do, they should have access to it, and it shouldn't be out of reach, either because they can't get to it physically, it's too far away, or they can't afford it. And of course, we've talked about the other factors for the global population. So I wanted to let you put in the chat box 3 ways that the human population impacts wild species. Because that was one of the things I wanted you to get out of this talk. So I'm not seeing anything come into the chat box. I'm not sure if that's because people don't have access to a chat box. So overhunting, great. So actually going and killing the sharks and the lions and the wolves. Pollution, absolutely. We didn't talk about pollution today, but using pesticides is killing the monarch butterfly population as an example.
You got this one?
Because it is killing all the milkweed that they need to survive and to have their larvae be laid upon so that they can eat the milkweed. Other sorts of pollution, certainly in the ocean, is fertilizer. Creates a lot of algae growth, and algae growth eats up all the oxygen, and then no other species can survive. So there are dead zones in the oceans and in our lakes. So pollution is another method that the human population impacts wild species. How about one more? We talked about where does the panther live? What does it need? It needs a habitat. It needs a place to live that's appropriate for it. And we are cutting forests. We are setting up a lot of farmland. We are putting houses and roads where there used to be native forests, native grasslands. So we are destroying a lot of habitats. And in fact, many people who study this say habitat, habitat, habitat is the major reason at this point for reduction in the number of species that are present. So the top 3 ways that you can reduce human impact. Mine was couched in a study that was done looking at carbon pollution. But why don't you type in a few top ways to reduce human impact that we did or didn't talk about today. Having one less child was the big one for the carbon footprint, absolutely. Eating a vegetable-based diet, absolutely. Getting where we reduce the amount of beef and milk cows that are frankly polluting a lot of areas. Living in a smaller house, going carless, absolutely. Cameron wrote in a half-Earth theory. I think E.O. Wilson has proposed that, and he's a famous biologist, saying that half the Earth belongs to the other species, as opposed to us using up more than our fair share, more than half the Earth in terms of what we consume and what we pollute. So I think that reducing human impact, when we think about it, is voting. It's voting for people who want a sustainable planet, asking people who are running for office to be cognizant, and what kind of policies are they going to put in? Are you going to have better urban boundaries? Are you going to create public transportation? So there's so many ways that we can improve our ability to live on this earth without harming it. And that may take a different economic agenda. So some people, in fact, I see it all the time because I'm looking for it. What's the downside of reducing population? Well, the concern is that people are going to get older and older, and there won't be young people to take care of them, or younger people to put into the Social Security system, for example. Well, we need to deal with that. There are other mechanisms or methods of economics that people think about called steady state economics, that we provide more jobs requiring fewer hours so that people are employed in service positions more than manufacturing, for example, or pursuing other, educational pursuits, so that we come up with different economic models to manage a declining population, a declining younger population in countries. So these things can be managed. So the best practices to reduce global population growth, why don't you shout them out in your own classroom and have somebody type them in. Drawdown.org. Oops, I think I just deleted it. Either drawdown.org or drawdown.com. Drawdown.org. Oops, I think I just deleted it. Either drawdown.org or drawdown.com. It was a effort of Paul Hawken, who has looked at climate change, and he worked with a lot of volunteers to come up with the top 100 methods to address climate change that are economically feasible right now. And number 6 and number 7 were divided. Number 6 was education of women, empowerment of women through education. And number 7 was providing contraceptives to all women who wanted them. If you combine those two, they're number 1 in addressing climate change. But that's a really good resource for folks. If people want more information online regarding contraception, got some myths out there that you want to bust. Bedsider.org is a great website as well to understand what options are available. Obviously, people can abstain. And in fact, young people have chosen in many circumstances to abstain. The age of first sexual contact is older than it used to be. And, that's certainly a choice as well. So are there other questions that people have about population or population's impact on the other species who live on our planet? Or comments about what you have wanted to do? Do any of you want to run for office? So this is a slide that shows the center's website, biologicaldiversity.org. We have a program dedicated to educating and proposing policy to reduce, to make people aware of the impacts of meat that's called Take Extinction Off Your Plate, as well as another on population. So again, I'll take any additional questions. Thank you for coming to this talk and signing up.